In this video, we're going to look a little bit deeper into cascading style sheets. And from what we've talked about so far, you know that styling a web page using CSS involves creating rules, and those rules contain two parts: a selector to indicate which elements the rule applies to, and one or more declarations that control the presentation of these elements, and those declarations being the property value pairs. If there's a part of the page that you want to make certain color or size, then you need to use the correct selector to target that part of the page and the correct properties to change their appearance. Properties are grouped together in related functionality. There are properties that enable you to control the presentation of tables, lists, and backgrounds. In addition, the new version of CSS, which is referred to as CSS3, focuses on modules, and we're going to be looking at these modules later in the term in a couple weeks. These modules are broken down into separate areas of focus selectors: those that control color, those control backgrounds and borders, multi-column layouts, media queries, fonts, 2D transformations, 3D transformations, and animations and transitions. But again, those modules we'll talk about in a few more weeks. There are several properties that enable you to control the appearance of the text in your documents, and these can be split into two groups: those that directly affect the font and its appearance, and those that would have the same effect on the text irrespective of the font used. And an example of that would be color. It doesn't matter what font it is. If you want to change it to red, it's going to be red no matter what the font, as opposed to one that directly affects the font, such as italicizing it. That only affects that particular font and what it'll appear like. First, we want to make sure we understand the basics about typeface and font. These two terms are interused way too much, and they mean totally different things. The typeface is a family of fonts, such as the Arial family. The font is a specific member of that family, such as Arial 12-point bold. The typeface categories are serif, those are the ones with little feet, such as Times New Roman; sans serif, the ones without the feet, and you can see the samples here; and the monospace, where every letter is the same width. That's not an example of monospace, but the other two are examples of serif and sans serif. To apply a font to a CSS style, you use the font family property. Choose the font that makes text eye-catching and readable. In printed documents, serif fonts are easier to read for long periods of text. Because of screen resolutions, though, sans serif are usually easier to read on the screen. Won't show up unless it's actually installed on the user's computer. Now, we're going to see in CSS3 where you can actually specify a font and add the font. There's some issues dealing with that, but you can do that with CSS3. But in CSS itself, basically when you pick a font, it's got to be something that already exists on the user's computer. When you specify the font you'd like to use, you could also specify a couple backup choices, so that if they want to use Arial and they don't have Arial, you might have Helvetica or Bandana. So you could specify some others. We'll look at that in just a second. So you can specify a list of similar looking fonts to make sure that the appearance of your page is still what you want it to be. In this example, we're just going to look at the three different typefaces and how you would specify that. We'll talk about this class in another video in the near future, just either this week or next week. But the first one we're going to set as sans serif, the second one we're going to set as serif, and the third one we're going to set as monospaced. Well, where does that come from? We have a linked style sheet. So you can see then in the sans serif, we're going to use Arial, Verdana, and then sans serif. In the serif one, we're using Times New Roman, and serif. And the monospaced, Courier, Courier New, or monospace. Now what this means is that the font family is going to be Arial if that's on their computer. If that's not, then the computer or the browser is going to look for Verdana. If that's available, it'll use that. But if that's not available, then it's going to go to the sans serif. And when you see the sans serif, serif, and monospace at the end of these, basically that's going to go to the browser's default font for that particular typeface. So it would go into its own settings and find out what the default is for sans serif and use that. In the serif case, it would use whatever the default is for serif, and same for monospace. So this is how you would set up that font family. Here's the property on the left in blue, the colon to separate the property from the value. Each value here is separated by a comma. That's not always true on some of the things we're going to look at, but for a font family it is. And then we end each one of them with a semicolon. Look at this page then. You can see the difference in the three fonts. The sans serif has no feet. The serif Times New Roman has the little curly feet, if you will, at the end of every stroke. And then the monospace font, where everything is, it takes up the same amount of space no matter what type of letter it is. So here's just a few examples of combinations that are commonly used. You could pick out what you want out of this and use. There's also a good website here that would give you some ideas of how you might want to group some different fonts together. If you want to change the size of the text, you use the font dash size. And again, the colon to separate the property from the value. And then the value for this, the 1 pixel that you see here, the number is how many units, and then the abbreviation is the unit of measurement. The px is what the book would refer to as a length. Notice also that there's no space in here. It's 1 px, not 1 space px. There can never be a space in there. So you want to make sure that the number of units and the unit of measurement are right next to each other. So these sizes can be done in different units of measurement. The example I have there is pixels, and again the book refers to these as length, but they could be em, ex, pixels, px for pixels, picas, points, inches, centimeters, millimeters. It could be all of those, and those would fall under length. There's other ways of measuring these too that we're going to look at here in just a moment. The measurements commonly used with printed materials are picas, points, and inches, but those don't work well with screens because you're dealing with a pixelated screen. So for what you're doing on the computer, the web, is going to be different than when you want to print something. So for computers, or for computer screens I should say, pixels, keywords, EMs, which when you do that it's actually EM, and percentages work best. Pixels is the easiest to understand, and they provide a consistent text size across the different types of computers and browsers. All the computer screens are made up of little pixels. When you buy one, or when you set the resolution, you're setting the number of pixels across and the number of pixels up and down. So pixels is the best as far as getting right into how the computer screen is going to work with that measurement. So pixels is one that I highly recommend. You could use keywords. The book refers to these as absolute size. You could use percentages, and you can use EMs, which EM is actually doesn't, when you do it, it's 1 EM or 2 EM, not with the S. Those are length. You work by either adding or subtracting from the text size already on the viewer's browser screen when you use any of these methods. If you don't specify a size for text using CSS, the browser falls back on its pre-programmed setting or base size. And you can change the base size. You don't necessarily know what that base size is, because some people maybe with sight disabilities may go in there and make that base size a little bit larger so that they can easily read the screen. But if no one touches it, if they don't modify that, it's usually 16 pixels, the same as 16 pixels on most browsers. But again, you don't know that that default setting is there because someone may have changed that. The 7 keywords or absolute sizes let you assign a size that is relative to the base size. And you got XX small all the way through XX large. Medium is the browser's base font size. The other options then would increase or decrease the size by a factor of 1.2, and it would round it. So if the base size is 16, and that would be 16 pixels, and that's the medium, and you go to large, that would be 16 times 1.2, or 19.2, which would become 19. So that's how that would work. So each time you go up, you multiply it by another 1.2. So the extra large would be 19 times a factor of 1.2. Percentage values adjust text in relationship to the font size defined by the browser. Gives you a little bit more control than keywords. The font size is inherited, so a percentage will apply to the inherited font size. EMs, they work pretty much the same as percentages. Has its base in typography, where it refers to the size of a capital M for a particular font. Again, knowing that font size is inherited, the percentage will apply to the inherited font size. In IE6 and earlier, which shouldn't be an issue anymore, there's a problem sometimes displaying text when only EM units are used. The correction for that is that you could either stick a percentage value or set the font size in the body of the page to a percentage and then use EM units to size other text. But again, IE6 is pretty much gone. It should not be an issue anymore. So if you wanted it to be 50% bigger, that would be 1.5 EM in that. Relative size is relative in size to the surrounding text, and you could use smaller or larger for that. It's going to make it just a little bit smaller or a little bit larger. Let's look at an example. And in this example, we're just going to show you all the differences. We're going to use absolute values, pixels, points, picas, relative sizes, EMs, EXs. We're going to use them all just so you can compare them. In our style sheet, you can then see for yourself the font size being used. The absolutes, XX small, absolute 2, X small, small, medium. So you'll be able to see all those as well as all the other ones as we go through this or as we look at this page. So let's just look at how these all compare. So you can see then the absolute sizes from XX small all the way through large, what pixels look like from 9px up to 48px, and again when you're putting that in your code there would be no space there, what points look like, picas look like, relative sizes, this is smaller, this does not have anything, and this is just a tad larger. I very rarely ever use smaller or larger, but there are people that do. EMs, again notice that there's no S on that when you use it. Same with EXs, there's no S. Percentages, you have to actually use the percentage sign. Viewport is a new one, and a root element are new ones. So let's look at the viewport sized typography. CSS3 has some new values, and the viewport happens to be one of them. And it makes it relative to the current port size, viewport size. It's actually shipping or shipped with Chrome 20. Production usage isn't quite there yet, but it's coming, so you might as well be prepared for it. 1 unit of any of these values that you're going to see below here is 1% of the viewport axis. Well, what's the viewport? The viewport is the browser window size or the window object. So this becomes really important actually when we start dealing with handhelds and phones and things like that. So this is a great advancement here. If the viewport is 40 centimeters wide, then 1 VW, 1 viewport, is equal to 0.4 cms. So the choices that you have are down on the bottom here for using the viewport, and the first one is 1 viewport width, which is 1% of the viewport width, 1 viewport height, 1% of the height, or 1 V minimum, which is 1 VW or 1 VH, whichever is smaller. And you also have the option for Vmax, which would be a 1 Vmax then would be 1 viewport width or 1 viewport height, whichever is larger. So this is coming out, and expect this to take off pretty much as it comes out because of the usage of so many other different devices other than our traditional computer screen. The other one that the sample shows is a REM unit. It stands for root EM. Now remember, we talked about EMs, and EMs are basically a percentage. So 1 EM would be the same as whatever is inherited. So if you had some text, a paragraph that had, let's just say, 16 pixels, and you put a span in there and you wanted to do a 1 EM, well, that's going to be 16 pixels as well. If you did 1.5, that's 150% EM, or 1.5 EM is 150%, then that would be 24 pixels. Well, the problem with doing that is that it's relative to the font size of its parent. In this case, the example I'm telling you, is relative to the paragraph tag. Well, that can cause some compounding issues. You design this, you set that at 1.5 EM or maybe 0.75 EM, whatever it happens to be, and somebody else comes in and changes the size of the paragraph. Well, that also changes the size then of the EM. So you it can get a little compounding there when different people are playing with the same thing. What the REM unit does is it makes it relative to the root, or the HTML element, not its parent. So you could define a single font size on the HTML element itself, and then define all REM units to be a percentage of that. So in the example you see here, we have a HTML tag being set at font size equal to 62.5%. That's not uncommon to see. Basically, assuming that the user hasn't tampered with the settings in his browser, if it's 16 pixels, that makes the font by default for the entire page 10 pixels. So somewhere along the line then, like in the body here, we could set the font size to 1.4 rem, root EM, and then that's 1.4 times the 10 pixels, which is 14 pixels. And then you could do it H1. So rather than being relative to its parent, the big thing here is that it's relative to the root size, or the font size set in the HTML element itself. Now, as with anything with HTML5 or CSS3, you always want to be sure that you can use it. And the best place to do that is the website Can I Use. It's just caniuse.com, and then you can search for what you want to use, and it'll tell you which browsers, which mobile devices and such are using it. The font weight property. Most fonts have different variations, such as bold or italic. Well, browsers, instead of using the actual font Arial italic or Arial bold, they tend to use an algorithm that makes the normal version of the font and makes it thicker. Because it uses an algorithm, it means that you can also create lighter versions of fonts that may not have that lighter version. All the possible values for the font weight are normal, bold, bolder, lighter, and then 100 through 900 in 100 increments. You could not do like 150 or 101. They have to be in 100 increments. If we take a look at this, you can see that in our first paragraph, we're going to basically do a normal, bold, and then in the two longer ones, we're going to just have normal text with it bolder, normal text with it lighter. So we got two spans in there. And the second divider, we're using the 100 through 900 values, which are somewhat supported by some browsers, but not all that much. Each one specifying a lighter shade or a darker shade as you go up, with the medium being 500. So if we look at the CSS here, you can see how we're using the font weight, and the normal, bold, normal, bolder, bold, lighter, and then the 100 through the 900 is in there as well. So let's take a look at this, and you can see the examples then of how this works. And this one we have normal text, and then you can see the bolder in the middle of it. The second one we have bold text, and you can see the lighter in the middle of it. Now in Firefox, with 500 being the norm, you can see that the lighter numbers really don't do much. Now the 600 and 700 pretty much look the same. They're just a tad bolder, and then the 8 and 900 are quite a bit bolder. So you got two different phases to make it bolder, but making it lighter doesn't really do much for it. So if you're going to use this number system, then you're going to want to make sure that you check the browsers to see if it's working the way you want it to. Most uses of this is just to make it bold. The font style. This enables you to specify a font, whether it should be normal, italic, or oblique. Now, you're probably saying, what's oblique? Well, oblique is a version of the font. If it doesn't have italic, the oblique would be the computer actually taking it and making the font at an angle, taking just a regular font and angling it to represent what italicized would be. I mean, that's the true nature of oblique. While italic, the font would actually have that slant to it already. The creator of that would already have done that. In CSS, when you specify the font style property as italic, browsers usually take the normal version of the font and simply render it at an angle. So it uses an algorithm for that as well, and it just basically, italic is the same as oblique in a browser. The font variant property. These are two possible values for the font variant. It's either normal or small caps. So if you want something to be in small caps, you would use the font variant colon small caps semicolon, and then you would have the small caps as opposed to lowercase letters. If you've never used small caps before, we can take a look at that. You can see here we just have a sentence. This is normal font, but then in a span with a class of small caps, you can see that we actually have all lowercase in here. These are small caps, but in our style sheet we are setting those small caps using the font variant. So when we look at this in a browser, those same letters that we just saw that were typed in lowercase are actually in small caps. So we'll end this video here, and then the next video will pick up with some more properties that you can use to control text in your code.